Namaste, my name is Devdutt Attanaik. I am the author of the book Shikhandi and Other Queer Tales They Don't Tell You, The Fiction Pregnant King, and I have introduced recently a book which is called I Am Devine, So Are You, which affirms the dignity of gay people, queer people, transgender people, bisexual people, lesbians, by everyone. Through religion, through the karmic lens. Normally we look at religion as an adversary of sexuality, but this book called I Am Devine, So Are You presents the various ways in which religions can be an ally to the queer community. During our research, during writing the book Shikhandi, while writing The Pregnant King, while writing the introduction to I Am Devine, So Are You, one thing was very clear that the Indian religions are very different from the Western religions. By Western religions, I mean religions of the Abrahamic faith, such as Judaism, Christianity and Islam. In these religions, the fundamental premise is you live only once, and in this one life, you have to live by God's law. And He decides whether it's right or wrong, and based on your actions on Judgment Day, you go to heaven or hell. And there is a constant tension between God's law and God's love. And therefore the question is always whether God allows you to be queer or His love is large enough to allow you to be queer. Now this approach where law plays a significant role is not found in the Indian traditions. Now the unique thing about Indian traditions is that they are based on rebirth or punarjanam or karma. Therefore they are called karmic faiths. So Buddhism, Jainism, Hinduism, Sikhism all fall in this basket of karmic faiths. And in karmic faiths, the question is, you don't live once, you live many lives, and each life carries the karmic burden of the previous life, and how you live this life determines the karmic burden of your next life. And that's how the whole thing is designed. So it's a very different approach. There is no God, there is no rule, there is no right and wrong. It is basically you are a function of your karma. And in this world, the Indian worldview, when you start reading the scriptures, you notice that there is a familiarity not with one gender or two genders, but three genders. So there is always three genders. You find this in Sanskrit books, you find this in Tamil books, you find it in books like Patanjali's Mahabhashya, which is a commentary on Panini's grammar. You find this in Charaka Samhita, which is on anatomy, physiology and health. You find this in Manusmriti, you find this in Arthashastra, you find it in Kama Shastra. All the books are unique in that they refer to three genders: the male gender, the female gender, and the third gender, which they call Tritiya Prakriti. Now different words are used for this across these ancient literature for the third gender. They use words like Napunsaka, Pandaka, Pedi, Kliba. Now when you look at these words, we have to ask ourselves, what do they mean? And different scholars have different opinions. Do they mean non-man? Do they mean effeminate? Do they mean bisexual? Do they mean non-heterosexual? I think the simplest way to put these words, put them together, is a word called queer in English. The way queer sort of is an umbrella term that is used for gays, lesbians, bisexuals, transgender, intersex people, all people who don't identify themselves with heteronormativity. And I think the words like Napunsak, Kliba, Kinnara, another word, Pedi, Pandaka in Pali literature, all these words which are found in all our traditions refer to queer sexuality. That is the umbrella term for lesbians, gays, bisexuals, transgender, intersex, everybody. And that is the way we should look at it. So the ancient Indians were very clear there are three genders: male, female and queer. Where do you find this? As I said, in Patanjali's Mahabhashya, which is a commentary on Panini's grammar. It recognizes three genders. You find this in Buddhist Pali literature. You find this in Jain Agama literature. You find this in Manusmriti. You find this in Arthashastra. You find it in Vatsyayan's Kama Shastra. Now, that means they acknowledge the existence of three genders. You find in Natya Shastra, Bharata Muni, when he talks of theatre, describes how should an actor play a Napunsak's role. We also have a small play or bhana called Ubhaya Abhisarika, which describes the interaction between the storyteller and a Napunsaka called Sukumarika. Now, so they acknowledge the existence of Tritiya Prakriti, or the third gender, TP for short. So TPs are present across these across these cultures. and in all these books, in all these writings. Now the question is, how do they treat them? Before that, just to show you how important this concept of third gender is, you have the ragas. All the ragas in the musical space have been classified as male ragas, female ragas, and as Napunsaka ragas. You have in Shilpa Shastra, rocks are classified as male rocks, female rocks, and Napunsaka rocks. Planets are divided. There is Napunsaka planet, Mercury, which is both male and female. So Buddha planet, planet of Wednesday, is considered both male and female. So you find this concept of third gender across scriptures in India. Now, how do you value it? Do you see it as good or bad is the question. The first question is, of course, do they exist? Yes, they do exist in our tradition. The second question is, how did ancients value it as good or bad, to be included or not included? And that is a different question. So first let's see if it is, how was it seen in the Puranas, where the gods, the Hindu Puranas, where the gods you see are sometimes taking male form. The male gods become female, the female gods become male. You have these stories of Krishna, who is also Kali in the Baul traditions. This is called Keshto Kali. Or you have Ardhanareshwar images where male and female merge together. You have stories of Krishna becoming Mohini. You have stories of Vishnu and Shiva together producing a child. So Harihara Sutta, the union of two males to create a child. You see stories of the goddess like Nanda and Sunanda, Dayama and Durgama, Chamunda and Chotila, where the goddess refuses to have a male companion and has a female companion who is either identified as a friend, her daughter, her sister, or just a companion. Now, how do you interpret these images? In Vrindavan, when you go, you have got Shiva, who takes the form of Gopeshwar Mahadev. He becomes a woman to enjoy Krishna's Rasa Leela. You have stories where Ram welcomes the Hijdas to Ram Rajya, saying that you are part of my Ram Rajya. It's part of the Hijda stories, the Hijda folklore. Or you have stories in Tulsi Ramcharitmanas. There is a clear line where it says that man, woman, Napunsak, plants, animals, all are dear to me. Sarva mere liye priya hai. Ram is saying this to Kaka Bhusandi in Tulsidas Ramcharitma, that they're all equal to me, I love them all, provided they give up malice or kapat. So 500 years ago, these words were still being used, and Ram is telling Kaka Bhusandi, in his eyes, the man, the woman, and the Napunsak are all equal if they give up kapat. So you see a very different approach which we don't find today in society. So what has shifted? If all these religions were sort of acknowledged in Buddhism, you have Napunsaka, and Jain you have Napunsaka. What happened in these religions over time? So you have to first approach it from 3 points of view. First is from a dharma point of view, then from a moksha point of view, and finally from the British colonial law point of view. From the dharma point of view, the dharma shastras which were written, they were focused on marriage and childbearing. Now, the moment you talk about marriage and childbearing, the Napunsaka doesn't play a very important role, and therefore he is given a secondary position. So in the Dharma Shastras, in Artha Shastra, in Anusmriti, you do have punishments for gay sex, but you see the punishment is just a fine or taking a bath to purify yourself. Greater punishment is if you have intercaste marriage. In fact, there are punishments of death for intercaste marriage. That's the real issue. Being non-heteronormative, the problem was you will not have children, and that's the problem in the Dharma Shastras. Or you'll get polluted, and therefore there is purification rites. Now when it comes to Moksha Shastras, which is talking about liberations, which is talking about giving up your physical and worldly pleasures and rising to the spiritual plane, you find again a discomfort with queer identities, with the Napunsaka, or for any form of sexuality, both heterosexuality and homosexuality. You find this in Buddhism, Jainism, and in the monastic traditions of India, where there is a rejection of any form of sexuality, not just homosexuality. All sexuality is bandhan, is karmic pollution which holds you back, it doesn't help you liberate yourself. And therefore even today when you talk to some of the Hindu leaders who are wearing saffron robes, they will say that sexuality should be secondary and primary should be spirituality. And they really refer to all kinds of sexuality. And therefore in Jainism, while there is a lot of conversation about gender studies and sexuality, it is a filtering process. Even in the Vinaya Pitaka of the Buddhists, there is a filtering process. The Pandakas have to be kept out of the Sangha, of the monastery. So this is Moksha Shastra. So essentially the role of the Napunsaka was in the realm of Kama. So Dharma, Artha, Kama, Moksha are the 4 main aims and pillars of Hindu philosophy. and you find that the Napunsakas were clearly important in the Kama Shastra. There is a description in the Kama Sutra of an effeminate homosexual and a straight acting homosexual. So these words like Stri Rupi Napunsaka and Purusha Rupi Napunsaka. This description is there. They are described as people who perform as masseurs and give pleasure through oral sex. So these kind of forms are there, and you see them as working in the pleasure industry, which suddenly you start seeing how they are being located in society. And we do know that in the Islamic period of Indian history, which is during the Mughal rules, many of the people who identified themselves as transgender and queer found employment in the women's quarters of kings and sultans, and they worked as musicians and dancers. So they were pleasure providers. They were service providers and pleasure providers. They became part of nutties and nuts and the kind of performative spaces in India. But in the caste hierarchy, these were seen as inferior. So they were not mainstream. While they were present and acknowledged, they were sidelined. And when the British came, they started identifying these as criminal tribes, and they started notifying them, and they became these criminal tribes. And that is the time, these laws which were British laws, which sort of really ruined some of the employment of people who identified themselves as transgender, Kinnara, Klibba, Hijra, as criminal tribes. And then we are told that this has led to their, and then came the sodomy laws, and the sodomy laws sort of sidelined them. They were no longer in the mainstream. They went underground, invisible. They had no source of employment, and that created havoc in the social structure. So you were rejected by the Dharma Shastras, who looked at you as pollution, by the Moksha Shastras, who felt that sexuality is secondary to spirituality, and British laws, which came with the Abrahamic traditions that God doesn't allow it. But if you look at Indian philosophy, they were all part of society. All this, as Tulsidas very clearly says in the Ramcharitamanas, and expresses the sentiment for Ram. Ram is very clearly stating that man, woman, and the Napunsaka, or the queer person is as dear to him as anybody else, provided he gives up malice. And this is the idea. If your spiritual upliftment, what I call Atma-gyan, if you have Atma-gyan, then you look at everything equally and you treat everything with dignity and respect. If you don't have Atma-gyan, that means you are indulging your ego, then you have hierarchy. You have gender hierarchy, caste hierarchy, social hierarchy. That creates exploitation, inequality, and unhappiness all around. And I feel as a culture, we have to reclaim our past. We have to encourage Atma-gyan, which allows us to look at all genders equally and give everyone dignity and respect, so that they can all be mainstreamed. And a main step towards is to give them, to use the law and reject this law which denies basic human rights to this inconvenient sexual minority. And I hope the government will listen to us and like Ram, welcome us into Ram Rajya.